For some of you who are close to my age or older in Georgia, the name Steve Dugan will ring a bell. At 16, Steve was a force to be reckoned with in Georgia politics and was considered a child prodigy in the political world. He was often written about in the Atlanta newspapers and other newspapers throughout Georgia as a rising star, with some believing he would someday be President of the United States. A young man with a brilliant mind, Steve became a close confidant of a future President of the United States in his campaigns for Georgia's governor. An excellent orator, Steve became one of Jimmy Carter's spokesmen and often gave speeches on his behalf. He most likely would have been part of his administration in Washington if he had not resigned during Carter's 1970 run for governor. Steve Dugan later worked for Congressman Jack Brinkley before Steve switched parties and ran against his former boss, a popular U.S. congressman, for his seat in Congress in 1976. Not surprisingly, Jack Brinkley hired him as part of his staff in Washington after he shellacked Dugan in his congressional race. Steve Dugan is a magna cum laude graduate of the University of Georgia and a graduate of Walter F. George School of Law. In this incredible conversation, Steve, now 74 and not in the best of health, talks about his friendships with Carter and Brinkley and tells behind-the-scenes stories that are both delightful and inspiring, and you will not hear anywhere else. You will learn that Steve's life has been anything but smooth sailing since his days in politics. He talks about his wonderful wife, but candidly about his bad decisions, depression, despair, and rock bottom, and how God put wonderful people in his life at the right time and place to save his life. He also talks about the importance of God's Word in his life and how he uses it to stay close to God and to find encouragement. The interview is broken into two parts. You're about to hear part 1, episode number 121, and then part 2 will be the next episode to be released as episode number 122. Get ready to be enlightened, entertained, and inspired. You're about to meet Steve Dugan.
Viewing life from a hearse, it could be worse. Laugh, think, and cry with the country undertaker.
This is Bruce Goddard, and you're listening to the View from a Hearse podcast. My guest today is Steve Dugan. I knew of him when I was in high school. He was 4 years older than me. I knew his sister, Sally, who was in my class, and I knew Steve as a political operative, very active in politics. He probably didn't know me at that time, but still I saw him and saw what he was doing. I was very impressed when I was in high school, and then recently saw him on Facebook. I hooked up with him and realized he'd written 3 books. He's had a very interesting life, which certainly has not been easy, but he's had there's some interesting things that's happened. So he's a lawyer. He certainly has been a political operative, and now he's an author. So, Steve, thank you for stopping and talking to me today. Thank you very much.
Well, I appreciate you giving me this opportunity.
Well, I can't wait for people to hear some of your story. I think they're going to want to buy your books before we're done. But first, let's talk about a little bit of you moved from Newnan, Georgia to Fort Valley, Georgia, and I went to high school. We went to the same high school. So talk a little bit about how that happened. How did you end up in Fort Valley, Georgia from Newnan?
Well, we lived in Newnan, and my daddy, all my life, he was an accountant, and he was working for a company in Grantville, which was a little town outside of Newnan. And then I remember one Saturday going with my daddy to Griffin, where he met the Luce brothers, who owned Bluebird Bus Body Company.
Right.
And they offered him a job of being the financial director of Bluebird. and Daddy decided to do it, and so that's how we ended up moving to Fort Valley.
So, folks, that's Fort Valley, Georgia's claim to fame. Bluebird Bus Company, school bus company, huge company. We all know the Luces. They're local people, wonderful people. So that's a great story in itself. So how did you get into politics, Steve? You moved into this new town. You were brand new. I thought it was interesting, as I read in your books, how you ended up in politics. That was a pretty funny story.
Well, it's the truth. It's really ridiculous. When we lived in Noonan, I went out for all the sports teams. I went out for football. I couldn't make the team in football. I went out for basketball. Not only I got cut the first day, but the coach called me over when the practice was over and put his arm around me and asked me if I'd ever had polio. I thought that was a bad sign. I said, "Not that I know of, Coach." And he said, "You would have known, kid." So that was the end of my basketball career. Then I was trying to be on the baseball team, and I'm probably the only person who they brought in a relief second baseman for, because I go out to play second base and I'm praying, "Dear God, don't let anybody hit the ball towards me." And the first time a guy swings a bat, the ball comes right to me. Well, I fielded it, which I thought was a miracle. All I had to do was throw the ball to first base, which was right there. I threw it over the guy's head and hit a lady sitting in the stands. Well, people accepted that, but I said, "Now, God, please don't let them hit another ball to me." The next ball comes right to me, a ground ball. Miraculously, I fielded it, threw that over the first baseman's head, hit a little baby sitting with his mama in the stand. After that, the umpire called timeout and they evacuated the stands. And then the manager came out and relieved me in the middle of the inning at second base for fan safety. So after all that, I understood I wasn't going to be an athlete. But one thing was, I liked girls, and I knew girls liked athletes. So I sat down at my little desk and I decided I'm going to figure out why girls like athletes. And I finally figured it out. They liked them because they were in the newspaper every day. There was a whole section about athletes. And I thought, okay, girls like guys who are in the newspaper every day. I can't be an athlete. Who else is in the newspaper? Well, I noticed they had a section about dead people. I figured that wouldn't help me get a girl. Then I noticed they had a section about criminals. I thought, well, if I'm in prison, that won't help me get a girl. The only other people that were in the newspaper every day were politicians. And I decided I'd rather try to get to work in politics than be dead or in prison. That's how I got into politics.
Wow. You talk about in your book, and I know this will come up later, but we'll go ahead and talk about it. You were adopted by your parents, and you had wonderful parents, the parents that adopted you. You nothing but wonderful memories of them, but that impacted you the rest of your life. Just talk a little bit about that and how the fact that you were adopted and the feelings you had, how that impacted you.
Well, the first real thing I remember about it was when I was 4 years old. Up until then, it was just mom and daddy and me. I didn't think much about having been adopted. But when I was 4, mom and daddy decided they wanted to adopt a little girl from the same orphanage that I came from. And so they didn't want me to feel left out of the process. So I remember one night after Daddy finished work, Mom and Daddy and we all went to this orphanage. And we go into this room, and this lady who must have been in charge came in and she says, "Okay, now we're going to bring out 3 little girls. I can see them now in 3 little pastel bassinets." And the lady said to me, "Okay, Stevie, you go pick your sister." Well, I was horrified, but I remember walking over to these bassinets and looking down at these three little baby girls. And I just picked the one in the middle because I was sort of horrified about the whole situation. And the lady said, "Okay, that's going to be your sister." And then after a few minutes, it was time for mom and daddy and my new sister and me to leave. And while we were walking out of that place, this lady says to mom and daddy, "Now remember, if this little girl doesn't work out, just bring her back and we'll give you another one." Now, maybe that lady was just joking. I don't know, but boy, that made an impression on me because I thought if I don't work out, they could bring me back too. And, it just sort of, I never did forget it, but I didn't ask mom and daddy about it because I thought it would hurt their feelings if I asked about being adopted. And so I didn't ever say anything, but I think that pretty much caused me to have a lot of trouble trying to believe in unconditional love. I don't know how much it affected my life. I just know I remember that real well.
Well, you went on, you moved to Fort Valley. We're going to get back in these stories because I want to talk about the Jimmy Carter and Friends book first and talk about some of these stories. But you went to Washington and Lee in Lexington, Virginia. You transferred to University of Georgia. You graduated law school from Walter George Law School at Mercer. All that is true, correct?
Yeah, you got it right.
You have written 3 books. I've read all 3 of them, Steve. And the one was entitled, we're going to get to all 3 of them, but the one was entitled Jimmy Carter and Friends. And, I thought it was very interesting. Talk about how you met Jimmy Carter and what you were doing and a little bit about that relationship.
It was my first year at Fort Valley High School. It was my sophomore year, and it was 1966, early 1966. There had been an affirmation Vietnam rally at Atlanta Stadium in Atlanta, and I had gone to it, and the weather had been terrible, and there was almost nobody there. I remember we got to sit in that club section between the 2 big tiers of stands because we had protection from the rain, and there weren't many people there. And on the way home, I thought, this is sort of depressing that not more people than this came out to support our soldiers in Vietnam. So I decided I'm going to ask the people at Fort Valley High School if we could have an affirmation Vietnam rally at Fort Valley High School. And so it turned out that they did have that rally. It was I believe it was a Saturday night. It could have been a Friday. The Fort Valley High School gym was packed with people. It was raining real hard, but man, that place was packed. Some of the local politicians, the politicians running for office in Georgia that year, wanted to come to this rally because they get to talk to a lot of people. And the high school set aside one classroom for the people who are going to be on the program to meet. And I was the MC of the program, and 2 of the people who came to it were Jimmy Carter, who then was a state senator from Plains, and Jack Brinkley, who at that time was a state representative from Columbus. They both came to be on that program. So in the room before we went out to do the program, I just hit it off with those 2 people, especially Jimmy Carter, and we got to know each other. And then when we went out to do the program, I remember introducing him. I remember what he said, but I would have forgot about it, except the next week, Jimmy Carter wrote me a letter, and I still have that letter. And it was just a real nice letter. And he said when he came to Fort Valley, he was going to come to see me. Well, politicians will say that kind of stuff, and then they'll never show up. So I just thought it was a nice letter. But the next week, I was in class at Fort Valley High School, and a lady came to the room and told the teacher the superintendent wanted to see me. And I thought, my goodness, now what have I done now? Usually when I get in trouble, they send me to see the principal. What could have I done to where I have to go see the superintendent? So I followed the lady, and we get to the superintendent's office, and she opens the door to his private office, and I go in there, and there's nobody in there but Jimmy Carter. And he says, sit down. And then he closed the door, and he sat down in a chair right beside me, and he started talking to me about his campaign. At the time, he had been running for Congress. Our congressman then was a Republican named Bo Calloway, who was a fine man. But Calloway decided he was going to run for governor. And Carter told me, he says, I'm not running for Congress anymore. I'm going to run for governor now. And I said, why do you want to run for governor if Bo Calloway's going to run for governor? If you just keep running for Congress, you could get elected. And he looked at me with those steely eyes. I mean, we were sitting so close together, our knees about touched. He stared me in the eyes and he said, you don't understand. I want to beat Bo Calloway. And I think if Bo Calloway had run for dog catcher, Jimmy Carter would have run for dog catcher against him. That's the kind of person he was. He was a very competitive man, and he wanted to beat Bo Calloway. So, you know, like I didn't ever expect him to come to my high school and get me out of class and talk to me, but he did. But then I didn't know if I'd ever see him again. And that summer, it was close to summer, and when summer started, like everybody else in Fort Valley, or a lot of people, I got a job working in a peach packing shed. And under that tin roof with no walls, it must have been 150 degrees. Mosquitoes were biting, and there was peach fuzz everywhere. And I was on the assembly line, and I said a prayer. I said, God, I hated it, this place. Please get me out of here. In Jesus' name, amen. The minute I said amen, I felt somebody tapping me on the shoulder. And I turned around, and there was this lady from the office of the peach shed, and she said, you got a call. Come with me. Well, us kids never got phone calls at the peach shed. They didn't let us go in that little office and use the phone, so I didn't know what was happening. But I followed her and went into that little office and picked up the telephone, and I said, hello. And this voice said, Steve, this is Jimmy Carter. Do you want to come to work for me this summer at my state headquarters in Atlanta? And I said, yes, sir, I sure do. And he said, well, I'm going to call your mom and daddy and ask them if they'll let you do it. And that was the end of that conversation. And I walked back to my place on the peach packing assembly line. And I thought, is this really happening? Is this really going to happen? And I got home, and when I got home, Mom and Daddy told me Jimmy Carter had talked to him and convinced him to let me do it. So the next Sunday, my daddy drove me to Atlanta and dropped me off with Jimmy Carter's campaign manager. And the next day, we went to the state headquarters at the Dinkler Plaza Hotel, and I started working for him.
How old were you then, Steve?
I would have been 16, I think. I think I would have been 16.
The point is, you were a young guy working for a guy that was going to be running for governor, and you had a lot of interesting stories. And I know one of the stories that got my attention, and when Jimmy was, I think he was appearing before the Atlanta Press Club for the first time and taking questions, and he gave you a job as a young kid. Talk about that.
Well, it was actually the first day I got there to the headquarters, and he told Mom and Daddy he was going to keep an eye on me. So in the Dinkler Plaza Hotel in downtown Atlanta, he and Miss Rosalind had a room, and they got me a room right beside their room. And then when Hamilton Jordan came to work for the campaign, Hamilton Jordan and I shared that room, but it was right beside the Carter's room. But the first day I got there, the first thing Jimmy Carter said to me, I want you to come with me. He said, I'm going to go make a talk at the Atlanta Press Club. Well, this was important because the people in Atlanta didn't know him. The Atlanta press didn't know him. And we got there, and he said, now, look, I want you to stay outside by this door while I make this talk. And when I finish, as the reporters are coming out, I want you to listen to what they say about me and about my talk. So I did what he said. I stood by the door while he made the talk. And when he finished, all these reporters walked out, and I listened to what they said. And when the last one left, Jimmy Carter came out, and we went and got in the car. And when we did, he said to me, "What'd they say?" Well, I called him Governor. I didn't think I was old enough to call him Jimmy. I didn't know what to call him, so I decided to call him what he was running for. So I called him Governor. And I said, "Well, Governor, they said they couldn't understand you." He had a really thick South Georgia accent, and the people in Atlanta could not understand him. So I told him I didn't like telling him, but it was the truth, and that's what he wanted me to tell him, the truth. I said, "They cannot understand you." Now, most politicians, they would have just thought they would have had their feelings hurt, and they would have just gotten mad.
Absolutely. Not just a politician, but anybody else would have. That is exactly right. Yeah.
But not Jimmy Carter. And when we got back to the headquarters, what he did, he called WSB TV in Atlanta, because they had an anchor man that he knew everybody in Atlanta could understand. And he called this man and he said, "I'm Jimmy Carter. I'm running for governor. And I just made a talk to the Atlanta Press Club, and some of them had trouble understanding me. And I want to know, can I come to WSB one night a week and have you teach me how to speak so that the people in Atlanta can understand me?" And I went with him the first week, and I remember getting in that car and going with him to WSB TV. And that's the thing about Jimmy Carter. If he saw a weakness that was coming between him and achieving his goal, he didn't have any pride. He just went to work to correct the weakness. And I thought that was a great lesson I learned.
Oh, my goodness. That's a lesson for anybody, because what you said is true. Most people, politicians, anybody else, you'd be offended. Well, they need to learn to hear me. They think of reasons why that was not true. It says a lot about him, yeah.
Yeah, most politicians' attitude would be, "Hey, the problem can't be with me, it's with them. They need to go to speech lessons to learn how to understand me."
Right.
But Jimmy Carter's attitude was, "If they don't understand me, that's my problem, and it's my job to correct it." And so that was the kind of person he was.
And that carried over the rest of his career, and that was part of his DNA when he was president. He still had that attitude. You know that was going on when he was president, that he would, if he saw something, he'd reach out to get help.
He never changed. The basic things I saw when I got to know him never changed.
Right. So the other thing that I found interesting, you must have been quite an orator as a young kid, because he had you speaking for him during the campaign. I mean, you were traveling around when things he could not be. He would send you to speak, and you were a teenager. Just talk about that experience. I know that had to be a lot of fun, but you had to have some talent for him to be turning that over to you.
I tell you, I was talking to my wife the other night, and I said, I never will understand what Jimmy Carter saw in me. I just can't understand, and now I'll never get to ask him. And I don't understand. I don't have a clue. I remember talking to him a lot of times, and I remember some of the stuff he said to me. I don't remember anything I ever said to him. But anyhow, on what you're saying, in the 66 campaign, I was his teenage campaign manager. They sent me to talk to this group of teenagers in a real rich section of Atlanta where the voters in that neighborhood were probably going to be for Ellis Arnold. He was a liberal candidate running in that campaign. But they sent me to this house of these wealthy teenagers in this wealthy neighborhood of Atlanta. And I made this talk to them. And, my approach to every type of talk is if you point out a weakness in your own position, they'll listen to what you're trying to say. So I said, Ellis Arnold is probably smarter than Jimmy Carter. But Jimmy Carter's plenty smart. He went to Georgia Tech. He graduated from the Naval Academy. And I thought that was a good way to approach it. Everybody knew Ellis Arnold was smart. Somehow, some Norman Shaven back then wrote a daily editorial on the editorial page of the Atlanta Constitution. And the next morning, his little column on the editorial page, somehow he had heard what I said. And the headline of his little column was, Carter spokesman admits Arnold is smarter. Well, I didn't expect that would get in the newspaper. I still don't know how it did. I want to tell you, I was in that headquarters that morning having a donut, and in comes Miss Rosalind. And she had the newspaper in her hand, and she looked pretty mad. And she walked over to me, and she looked me right in the eyes, and she says, don't let me ever hear that you ever said anybody was smarter than Jimmy again. And then she turned around and walked out. And she was just as nice to me as she could be. She practically treated me like I was one of their own sons. I've got a lot of letters from her right here in this house. But Jimmy Carter would have never said anything to me about it. But boy, if anybody said anything negative about Jimmy Carter, Ms. Rosalind, she didn't like it. And she'd let you know about it. So I remember that.
He listened to her. She had great impact on what he was doing, right?
She was his number one advisor. When he became president, she was the only first lady in history that sat in on the cabinet meetings at the White House. They were a team. They did everything together. And I'll tell you something, Ms. Rosalind was more competitive than Jimmy Carter. Ms. Rosalind hated losing more than Jimmy Carter did. They were a great couple. And when they campaigned, in some campaigns, the spouse of the candidate will go to the rallies, and before the rally, they'll stand up when they get recognized. That isn't how the Carters did it. The way the Carters did it, when they had a campaign, every member of that family went somewhere different every day. Miss Rosalind would go somewhere. Jimmy Carter would go in a different direction. Miss Lillian would go somewhere. Later, when their sons got older, they'd go somewhere. They were hard-working people. Nobody ever outworked the Carters, and they were just as determined to win as they could be.
You spent time with them in Plains. You'd stay at their house. You said they treated you almost like one of their kids. You stayed with his mother, Miss Lillian. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I didn't really do that in 66, but after the election in 66, Jimmy Carter did better than anybody thought he would, but he barely missed out on being in the Democratic primary runoff. But immediately after that election was over, he started running for the 1970 race for governor. He literally started 3 years before that race in 1970.
Right.
And he wrote me a letter, and he told me he wanted me to start coming to see him in Plains, and said I should come and spend a weekend with him. So I started going to Plains, and I remember one weekend I went to Plains, and the Saturday morning, if you've ever been to Plains, it's on the main street. There's the Carter Peanut Warehouse.
Right.
And if you go through it to the very back of it, there's a little room in the back, and that was Jimmy Carter's office. And I remember one Saturday morning being in there with him, not in room but his desk, his chair, and a chair on the other side of his desk where I was sitting. And I remember he had an old wood-burning stove, and he was wearing boots and a red checkered flannel shirt and khaki pants. And he's sitting at that desk putting wood into that stove. And behind him, he has a map of the state of Georgia that has every county outlined. And he had taken magic markers or something and colored every county a different color depending on what percentage of the votes he got in the primary in 1966. And I remember sitting in there with him one Saturday morning and just listening to him talk about his campaign and what he was going to do and how that map helped him decide where he wanted to go. And then after that morning, that afternoon, he took me to walk on his property. They had lots of property around Plains, and I just remember walking through those woods and him talking to me about the political campaign that was still a couple of years away and what he was doing to try to win.
Unbelievable. So I guess it was during the 70 campaign is when they got a little bit of financial trouble and you actually resigned, and you say that's something that you look back on it and you wonder if you did the right thing. So talk about that.
I don't think I did the right thing. I think I did the wrong thing, and I feel bad about it too. I still do. What happened was that summer in June, I got engaged to my wife. And then in July, we decided instead of waiting a year, we were going to get married that September before college started up again. When Jimmy Carter asked me to work in the 70 campaign, I had told him that I wanted to. I said, but I'm older now and I really need to make some money. And he said he understood. And he did, but the campaign, you can't ever tell what's going to happen in a campaign. In that 70 campaign, he had to win. I remember we had a meeting about 5 weeks before the time I was supposed to get married, and I did get married. And Hamilton Jordan was the campaign manager in 1970, and he said to me, look, he said, campaign's running low on money, and he called him Jimmy. I didn't ever call him Jimmy, but he said, Jimmy wants us to keep working until the primary without getting paid, and then he'll pay us after the primary. And you know what? I did a very immature thing that makes me think I wasn't a very loyal person and makes me ashamed of myself. I said, Hamilton, I told him I needed to make money in this campaign, and I'm going to get married in 5 weeks, and I'm not going to do it. I've got to make some money. I'll leave this, and I'll go and try to get a job for the rest of the summer at Bluebird. And that's what I did. And to this day, I think that was a very disloyal thing I did, particularly considering all the things Jimmy Carter did for me during my life. I should have kept working there. And I remember the treasurer of that campaign was a man named David Gambrell, and he was a lawyer in Atlanta. And he's the person, when Carter got elected governor and Senator Russell died, Jimmy Carter appointed David Gambrell to be the senator for the rest of Senator Russell's term. My wife, Julie, and I had gotten married, and we were living in Athens when Carter won the Democratic nomination for governor. And the next week, we got an envelope from David Gambrell, and boy, they had paid me off every penny that they said they were going to pay me for that campaign. And I just feel terrible that I didn't keep working for him after all he did for me. And I think, though, one reason I didn't do it was my pride. What happened was Jimmy Carter had hired me. Jimmy Carter had asked me to personally to work in his campaign in 66 and 70. But when it came time to ask me to keep working without being paid in 70, he asked Hamilton to ask me. And I think if Jimmy Carter had asked me himself, I would have said yes. I think I just got my feelings hurt that instead of Jimmy Carter dealing with me directly, he was dealing with me through Hamilton. And that was petty on my part. And I wish I had done different,
But even after all that, he did some remarkable things for you. Number one, when you were in a really bad place in life, he showed up later in life. But talk about meeting him in the warehouse, or maybe you met Hamilton Jordan in the warehouse when he was about to run for president. Tell that story.
Well, this is an interesting story. When he was governor from January of 71 till January of 74. And it must have been late in 73. My wife and I went to spend the weekend at her mom and daddy's house in Noonan. And I decided to call Jimmy Carter. And so I called the governor's mansion that afternoon. And they said, well, Governor Carter and Miss Carter aren't here, and they're not going to be back till tomorrow or real late tonight. And I said, well, okay, I understand. Thank you very much. So that night, about 2:30 in the morning, we were all asleep, and I heard the phone ring. And then I heard Julie's daddy walking down the hall and knocked on the door of the room, Julie's room where we were. And I remember he said, son, the telephone's for you. And I thought, gee, I hope mom and daddy hadn't died or something. Why would anybody be calling me at 2:30? And I picked up the telephone, and this voice said, Steve, this is Jimmy. What can I do for you? And it was Jimmy Carter. And
at 2:30 in the morning. Wow.
Yeah, sort of surprised that he would call me, but he had just gotten back to the governor's mansion, and they told him I'd called. And he called me, and he said, look, he said, what about meeting me tomorrow? And he told me a farm outside of Griffin where he wanted Julie and me to go meet him. And I said, yes, sir, we'll be glad to. We'll be there. So the next day, Sunday, we got up and ate breakfast, and then we left Julie's mom and daddy's house to drive back home. And on the way, we went to this farm outside of Griffin, and Jimmy Carter was there. And so we talked to him, and he started saying stuff I didn't understand. He was obviously working to raise money for a campaign, but he couldn't run for governor again. Under Georgia law, governors couldn't succeed themselves. We had two popular senators by then, Herman Talmadge and Sam Nunn, and there wasn't any senatorial election that he could have gotten into. I just didn't know what was going on. But he told me one story there that day. He said, you know, since I've been governor, he says, every time one of these big shot Democrats comes to Atlanta, I invite them to come to the governor's mansion and spend the night. And he says, I talk to them late that night, and then I have breakfast with them the next morning. And he said, I'm trying to size them up. And he says, none of them have impressed me too much. I still didn't know what he was doing. So we were living in Warner Robins, and we got back to Warner Robins. And the next week, Hamilton Jordan called me up, and he says, I want you to come meet me at this warehouse outside of Atlanta. And I said, okay. And he gave me the address, and I drove to this big warehouse building outside of Atlanta. And I remember Hamilton Jordan was there, and we walked up to the door, and Hamilton had the key. Nobody had told me what this was about. And he unlocked the door, and we walked in, and I remember he turned on the lights, and this whole gigantic warehouse was full of stuff that said Carter for president. Big signs, all kinds of stuff you'd need for a presidential campaign. Hamilton, I said, what is going on? He said, Jimmy is running for president. He said, I'm going to work for him, and he wants you to work for him, too. And I looked around at all that stuff, and I said, Hamilton, I'm married now. I got a real job. I can't do this kind of stuff anymore. I said, y'all are going to get out there and run for about 3 months, and then you're going to go broke, and that's going to be the last anybody hears about this campaign. I said, I can't give up my job to do something crazy like this. And that was another time I failed Jimmy Carter, because he only asked me to do two things for him during the whole time I knew him. One of them was to keep working for him when he ran out of money during that 70 election. And the other thing he asked me to do was come to work in his presidential campaign. And very regrettably, both times Jimmy Carter asked me to do something for him, I said no. But every time I ever asked Jimmy Carter to do something for me, he always said yes. And that makes me very sad.
We will pick up with this conversation and the story of Steve Dugan in the next episode, number 122. Among other things, Steve will speak about his strange but wonderful relationship with Congressman Jack Brinkley and the importance of Jack Brinkley and Jimmy Carter in his life. Steve also will candidly talk about his foolish financial decisions that took him down a path from the halls of Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., to cleaning toilets in Columbus, Georgia, and the day a former president of the United States, with his Secret Service detail in tow, paid him a visit at his lowest place in life. Steve also talks about a wonderful wife who has stuck with him through thick and thin, and a faith in God that has only grown stronger despite the circumstances of his life. Did I mention he has written 3 books about it all? The story of Steve Dugan continues in episode 122. Thanks for listening.
Viewing life from a hearse, it could be worse. Laugh, think, and cry with the country undertaker.